Again, on this Sunday called the Prodigal Son, we are given examples about how the Lord deals with sin and with people who have performed unrighteousness. And there are many lessons in this particular reading which are very relevant to me. As a priest, I have confessed people who are in their 80s and have never been to confession in their life. Several times. I can't comprehend that sort of thing, particularly when a confession has been open to them. These are Orthodox people. And I wonder, how did they manage to live through their life to such a long time and never once go and stand before the Lord and ask Him for forgiveness? Most of the time they answer and say, well, I'm too ashamed to confess my sin. And of course, you prod them and you inquire of them and you ask them for elaboration on what is this major sin that they talk about, which is preventing them from coming to confession for all these decades. And when you finally get the answer, it's really nothing so special. This comes from many wrong understandings about Orthodoxy in general. The first one being is that there is no sin that the Lord does not forgive as long as one is faithful to Orthodoxy, is faithful to Christ, and does not worship other gods in various ways. And worshipping other gods in various ways today means all sorts of things. Astrology, for example, is a form of worship, and magazines that you find in shops are full of astrological predictions and guidances and all these sorts of things. The point is this, that there is no shame in confessing any sin that you think you may have done. When you prod these people more, you realise that they've confessed things which are far worse than the one they're not confessing. In other words, they have no understanding of the hierarchy of what is worse than the other. And this is another point that one needs to know about. In the reading of the epistle today, it is very relevant because it says that St. Paul, most sins are committed like outside the body. But fornication is an internal thing. Why is that so? The reason being is that in a true, I'll say, married life, rather than talk about people just just sleeping around. Two people are joined into one in a mystical way which we can only explain like briefly, but we don't get the full understanding of that, because it says it is like the joining of a person's soul to Christ's likeness. This becoming one out of two is like that, because Christ wants all his people to become of one substance, of one constitution, of one construction, which is the pinnacle of his creation. And when you are not present in that, that means that the space that has been reserved for you is empty, and your ability to grow spiritually if you don't confess those sins and you repose before that, leaves you in this sort of situation where you really don't know, are you saved or are you not? This is one of these sorts of things that you need to think about very carefully. Today, as you know, fornication and all that sort of life is taken for granted as a normal thing. Just because, like breathing, it's built into us, therefore I'm allowed to use it any way I like. Whether I'm married or whether I'm not married, or whatever. I can have as many partners as I like, again, whether I'm married or whether I'm not married, and do all sorts of things like that. People that do that are some of the ones which do not confess these sorts of things in their life. In other words, they separate themselves from the oneness that Christ wants knowingly. And for what reason? For nothing more than pride. For some sort of shame, some sort of shameful thing that they think. Things that I hear in many confessions, far worse than that. Far worse than that. So how come these people that commit things that are far worse than that have no trouble coming to confess it? Yet when it comes to this, somehow there is a barrier. Demonic forces understand how closely interwoven that aspect of our flesh and soul is, that they play on it in various ways and evoke in a person the idea that I won't confess it, or I will confess it. This time I'll confess. And they come and they blurt out, say a few things, but when their mind turns to that, they don't confess that part and let it go. And it's not the fact that they committed this, that is the worst thing. The worst thing is that through pride, they didn't confess it. They sort of separated themselves and did not confess that which brings them back into the church. Because after confession, the prayers that I read towards the end, there is a paragraph which says that reunite this person back to the church. Reunite him or her back to the church. That means that the sin has actually cut them away from the church. And for all intents and purposes, they're sort of no longer members. How shocking is that? To be actually cut away from that which brings upon your salvation. And by the way, to a priest is given some mystical gift where he doesn't really remember what you have said after a very short time. He doesn't remember. It's sort of like taken away, which shows that the confession is before God, and the priest is just a witness and the one that says the prayers of absolution and returns you back to the church. It's like a mini baptism again. You're baptized back into the church. And therefore you should have no misgivings about confessing anything at all that bugs you. Some people confess things which are not even sins. I don't know how they work this out, but they do. Of course, as I've said to you on many other occasions, we are like sick people in a fallen state. And therefore, every moment of our life is actually a sinful moment. It's just that we sometimes augment that, increase that, by committing some particular act which is part of the Ten Commandments or the Beatitudes or something like this. But in general, we remain sinful people, sick people. And it's this sickness that Christ came to cure us of. Because he came and committed no sin at all, and yet went through the path of death. But of course, death cannot hold God. You can't kill God overall, like many people do. Therefore, I ask you on this particular Sunday where we hear this parable about the prodigal son, this young man who, in his immaturity, in his youth, wanted to have a good time in his life. Understandable. Most young people go through that phase, usually in their teenage years and their early adult years, trying to find ways of enjoying life. Overall, there is nothing wrong with that, but it's how you do it that is important for your spiritual upbringing. Well, this particular young man joined himself to harlots and therefore loosened himself from Christ and became one with a sinful person, a woman, I guess. Leaving leaving the church as it was for that enjoyment. I also know as a priest that people that have done these sorts of things, not very long after, come to me and tell me how horrible it all feels now and how horrible it is tormenting my life. And this is especially true for people that have committed adultery. It's a very difficult thing to wash away the sins of adultery such that a person remains then in peace for the rest of their life, because it's going to always pop up. You go to say your prayers in the morning and it pops up, even though you have confessed it and you repented, you've never done it again. The thing that was committed pops up to distract you from your standing before God. Do not be afraid of any confession. But on the contrary, when that opportunity is given to you, run to it, because it's your way of being rejoined to the church and to Christ. And believe me, insofar as Christ is concerned, these things are really nothing. It's really nothing. It's the attitude and the approach that Christ is looking for. Because you notice that when this young son returned, his father, out of joy, provided him with a party, a big one. The older son heard all this and became disgruntled and went to his father and had the audacity to say to him, all these years I've been serving you kindly and doing all the right things, and you've never made a party for me. And his father said, well, you've always been with me, and I've never not allowed you to do whatever good things you want to do. And therefore you have no reason to be so disdainful of your younger brother, who out of immaturity and whatever wanted to taste life in a different way, and in that process got himself into a lot of trouble where he could have even died out of hunger or whatever. And it was only because his guardian angel prompted him and said, when you were living with your father, you had everything that you needed. Why don't you go back and repent before him and continue to live the type of life that you were living with him, where you had no particular needs? He did this with fear and tribulation, not knowing what his father's reaction would be. He thought his father would really tell him off, give him a hiding or something, or maybe even get rid of him, chase him away completely. But on the contrary, even before he got to the house, his father already ran out and met him and hugged him and kissed him and told his servants to prepare a party for him, because a lost soul had returned back into the path of salvation. And the older son should have understood this and been part of that and rejoiced with his father and the rest of the family there, instead of acting as if this son needs to be punished. After all, he came in his own free will, having realised his mistake, and he came with a great humbleness, seriously thinking that he will not be accepted. But he was, because God accepts every repentant sinner, no matter what they have done, as long as they have not denied the faith and not have turned to other gods, of which there are numerous ones today. I was given a little booklet last week about pain, because some of the sickness that I have. And these booklets were given out at a doctor's conference. When I read through it, there was not one mention about God, or Christ, or Christianity, or anything like that. But there were plenty of quotes from Buddha and all these weirdos that, you don't know who they are, as if these people know how to handle pain, or sicknesses in other words, and free themselves of it. And on almost every recommendation that they made, it had something to do with a sporting attitude. There was never anything beyond that. It was always, get yourself, involved in some sort of sport or something, do exercises, run around, all this and all that, and that somehow is going to get you out of your painful situation. But it doesn't. This conference was full of the top pain specialists of Australia and of some overseas. And this is the sort of medicine that they propose to you. Well, maybe for a small number of people, a bit of exercise might help in some respects. But if a person has a chronic situation, then all those things are not going to relieve them of their painful situation. It might make it even worse. And the simple solution is that Christ is calling you back to where you belong through these painful situations, so that you are able to grow to your maximum or optimal way that you are supposed to be. Because each and every one of us, born into this world and allowed to live in it, are expected to make something of ourselves which is God-pleasing, to give our part to that, out of joy for the fact that we belong to Christ, not because it's an obligation, not because of that, but out of joy that we belong to Christ and therefore to the kingdom of heaven, which sooner or later will either overshadow us or throw us into eternal darkness. Therefore, understand these sorts of things which are written often as parables, because Christ spoke often in those ways, not only to generalize the situation, but to implant in there various teachings which are unto salvation for us. And anyone who suffers in any way needs to always remember that it is allowed by the Lord for some reason, and it is your responsibility to try and find out what that reason is for. And yes, you can go, if you have a good spiritual father or mother, and ask. If you sort of come to a dead end, you can't figure out why am I in this situation, ask somebody who is on a higher spiritual level, and they may give you the answer. And it might be so simple to say, why don't I think of that myself? But the point is that it needs to be done. I forget how many billionaires there are in the USA and Russia, but one thing I can tell you is that none of them at all, lead a life of spiritual quietness and exaltation, despite all their money and all their power and all the things that they have. And some of the politicians that are in our times, which a lot of people initially began to praise that they were going to be saviours and do this and do that, as time goes by, show more and more the true face and the true situation of their souls, and it looks more and more ugly all the time. And they have to live with that, and in front of public, put on a face as if there's nothing wrong, but in private, what they do and how they behave is a different thing altogether. Do not be afraid of confession. Do not be afraid of the things that the church has given you to optimize the life that has been given you. Find out what you can do to serve Christ. And it can be in many forms. Many forms. Even a good word to somebody for some reason is already a form of working for Christ. I have married couples which lament that they have no children. Well, how do they know? They might have more children than any of us have. It's just that the child never got to the stage of being born. But they may have had many children. And the souls of those children will be seen in the kingdom of heaven. And they will know about that. So that's the type of festal period that we have now as we get closer to the Great Lent. Lessons to help us along so that we can go through these periods and meet the resurrected Lord. And if, for example, this is what our spiritual father taught, if, for example, during a Lenten period or something, you do that which husband and wives do, you don't go to pieces about it, because, as he said, it's a natural thing built into you, and it's given to you to test you, to strengthen you, so that slowly, or depending upon your own strength, you can learn how to handle those situations in your own life and grow spiritually. There are many, many things that can be said about this from all sorts of angles. The important thing to remember, as I said to you, is the attitude and the way you approach all this and how you handle it. Use these mystical gifts that the Lord has given us, knowing quite well that we are still living in a fallen state and will continue to do things which are outside the commandments, but can be brought back. Even holy people, even holy people, I won't mention any names, but I know that there was a priest in Sydney who was a holy person that had an alcoholic addiction, very badly. And yet, he worked miraculous things and helped many in various ways. And when he met Archbishop John, whom you all know, Archbishop John said to him, "Why are you not a monk? You're on that level of being at a high spiritual level. Why are you not a monk?" In any case, I think you get the point about this feast day that we have today, that all things are forgivable if a person repents. All things are given by God to bring us back into his fold when we go astray. Sometimes it's painful to do that return, but nevertheless, even the pain of the return is already a good thing, because it shows that we are willing to hang on to the true God and not go somewhere else. Some people go through life praying so hard and trying so hard to prevent something within their life, but never quite manage to achieve it. I don't know what God's judgment is upon that, but it's not a time where one needs to fall into despair and think that the Lord has abandoned you. But on the contrary, he might be allowing you to have these difficult periods in order to give you crowns. If you look at the lives of the saints, most of them had something in their lives which made it difficult for them. Some were very sick indeed. There were blind ones. Elder Ambrose of Optina could barely get out of bed. Because they were being tested to optimize their faith in Christ and therefore win crowns in the kingdom of heaven. And therefore thank the Lord for these things that are sent to us which prevent us from partying every day of our lives like the rest of the world does. And I can tell you that the people that do that continue to party and party and party because they never get any satisfaction out of those parties. They don't get any satisfaction. Because if they did, they'd say, I've had my fill, experienced this, and it's, I don't need it anymore. But because they don't get it, they continue to do these things. That young lady, Genevieve, whom we baptized a few weeks before she died from cancer, was an atheist a couple of weeks before, and something happened in her life where she realized that was all wrong and wanted to come to Christ. Her suffering, I think, was more with the rest of the family, who were staunch atheists and did not want her to be baptized and to join the church. And I was told that there was a group of men waiting to beat me up after I had finished because I baptized her. There's a picture of her there on the bottom shelf, where that bottle of oil from Saint Genevieve's tomb in Paris is. God help us in this struggle. This week we call Meat Fair Week. It's the week where we give up eating meat as part of the preparation for fasting. So we're led slowly into the situation, into the full fast period. If you read Saint Theophan the Recluse, who is probably my favourite spiritual writer, he will tell you that particularly carnal things stem largely from overindulgence in meat and meat things. How is that? That food can affect your spiritual life. Therefore, the church gives us this period to let go of those things so that we can concentrate on that which is needed for us to live a life in Christ. So those of you who have the strength can let go of your T-bone steaks and whatever, and you can still have milk products, cheese and all that. Well, I mean, you can have anything you like, really, but it depends on how seriously you take your spiritual life and where you want to go. May God help us in these struggles, and may we be in a position to meet the risen Lord this year, all of us, with the joy, the gladness that it's supposed to bring, and with the realization that we too will one day arise and be part of Him, part of His kingdom, part of His constitution by grace. A wonderful thing to work for, and a wonderful thing in which to spend your time on earth rather than in useless activities, particularly sinful activities. And be careful with your thoughts and your feelings, because that is where the spiritual life manifests itself, irrespective of what is done externally. You might meet somebody, how do you do? Haven't seen you for a long time. So good to see you, and all this and that. But internally you say, well, what a rat this person is, I wish he wasn't there. That's what the judgment's about. What your internal system is telling you, and not what your external situation is. God help us and protect us in this, and give us the understanding on how we may live our life with the gifts that have been given to us, big or small, that we may bring forth fruit. As Father Seraphim Rose, the late Father Seraphim Rose said, hasten to do the work of God, because it's later than you think. It's later than you think, and indeed it is later than you think. I can't, as a priest, I can't stand in front of a crowd and talk about things like marriage and whatever, when half the audience already live like married people but are not married. How are they going to take all that? Are they going to all of a sudden change because I said so? I don't think so. God preserve us and help us in all things.